Bobby Lee Claremont and the Criminal Element by Jeannie Mobley. Canton, Mississippi, 12:56 p.m. I couldn't deny that I was hungry, not with the way my stomach was grumbling. And as much as they annoyed me by calling me out, I was curious about Terrence and Leon's so-called proposition. But I wasn't about to go eat in the colored people's car. I had nothing against colored people. In fact, I liked what I'd seen of them on this train a far cry better than some of the white folks I'd become acquainted with. I figured colored folks were just folks, same as everyone else. Sister Mary Magdalene had often reminded me we were all equal in the eyes of God, which didn't quite explain the lot God had given colored folks. Maybe their fortitude needed extra testing, or maybe the good sister had been wrong, 'cause it didn't seem to me their separate was all that equal, or one bit fair. But fair or not, I was old enough to know who to associate with if I wanted to get on in the world. To a lot of upstanding white folks, associating with Negroes could taint a feller quicker than almost anything. And if I was in a train car with members of Chicago's underworld, I didn't want to do anything that would give them a bad impression of me. I wanted them to see that I could be bad in the best possible way. Hobnobbing with a couple of Negro kids might give them the impression that I wasn't of the right caliber. So, as the train pulled out from Jackson, I stayed put, in my own seat, in my own car, with my stomach rumbling. After a while, Mrs. O'Halloran and her acquaintances rose from their seats and disappeared toward the back of the train, where the whites-only dining car was located. The cop waited about 30 seconds before he followed, leaving me alone. I sighed and flopped down across my seat, letting my feet hang out into the aisle. If I was going to have to stay hungry until the next stop was sandwich carts, I might as well get comfortable, I thought, closing my eyes. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, a big hand was on my ankle and giving it a shake. I jerked upright so quick I banged my head on the window frame. One of Nanette O'Halloran's companions, the big soft one, had hold of me, and I was suddenly regretting having run from him earlier. He stepped closer, blocking my path to the aisle, and all but pressed his expansive gut into my face so that I was eye to eye with a gaudy ruby-studded watch chain that stretched across his vest. I forced my eyes up to his greased back hair and his small dark eyes, which were glaring down at me. "What you want?" I said. It came out in a squeal, sounding like a stuck pig, but I couldn't help it. He caught me by surprise. He gave a little snort of a laugh, sounding pig-like himself. "Well now, mon ami, it's not what I want, it's what you want. And that's what I've come to discuss," he said, his quick rhythmic Cajun accent sounding straight off the bayou. "What I want?" I repeated in surprise. I wanted an in with the gangsters. I wanted to walk into the headquarters of the Chicago mob, offer my services, and start raking in the dough. But I didn't see how this Cajun dandy was going to get that for me, so I decided to let him talk and see if he gave me any ideas. I shrugged and tried to look innocent. "Everyone wants something. In my line of work, I see it every day," he said. "Your line of work?" I repeated. He straightened, which made the button strain on his expensive vest. "You're looking at the proprietor of the Cajun Queen Supper Club," he said, meaning to impress. "Yeah? I thought Jimmy O'Halloran owned the Cajun Queen." He deflated a little, eyeing me with annoyance. "We were partners, but never mind that. What is it you want, kid? What are you after?" I smiled, trying to project more bravado than I felt. "I want it all." He gave a bark of laughter, followed by a few choice French curse words. "So now that I've told you what I want," I said, trying to be cool and slick, "what is it that you want?" "You haven't told me anything," he said, his face getting serious and threatening again. "Come on, kid, out with it. First you eavesdrop, then you follow us and run away when we spot you. What's your scheme?" I shrugged again. I didn't want to admit that the sight of him and his enormous knuckle-cracking associate earlier in the day had scared me, so I used the first excuse that came to mind. "Mr. Kelly told me to keep my distance, that's all," I said. At once his eyes narrowed down into slits. "Oh, he did he? To keep away from me, did he? And why did he tell you to do that?" I hesitated, unsure what to say. I'd hit a deeper nerve than I'd been angling for when I'd mentioned Kelly. Don't play dumb with me, kid. What did that little Irish weasel tell you while I had my back turned?" His heavy jowls were turning red, and a cowlick over his forehead had broken free from its heavy grease job, and was bobbing over his forehead like a rooster's comb. I glanced sideways. I could probably escape over the seats if he got violent. He didn't seem all that agile, so I decided to see what I could get from him, keeping my escape route in mind should I push too far. "Kelly didn't tell me anything, Mr. What's your name, anyway?" "Bugeaud," he said a little grudgingly. "Alphonse Bugeaud." I raised my eyebrows as if I knew something. "Oh, so you're Alphonse Bugeaud. I didn't kill him," Bugeaud blurted, little beads of spittle accompanying his words into my face. "No," I said mildly, as if I might or might not believe him. If there was one thing I'd learned around the sisters, it was how to be non-committal. "I'm not the only one who had something to gain by Jimmy's death, you know," he growled. "But I didn't want the Cajun Queen to myself. Jimmy was the life of that place, and I respected that, even if I didn't always agree with him. And Nettie's all set to profit too, if that life insurance pays out. Did they tell you that? No, they wouldn't, would they?" "And Mr. Kelly, how would he profit?" I asked. His eyes narrowed again, and he drew in a deep breath as he suddenly seemed to realize how loose his tongue had gotten. "Brian Kelly's a Yankee. Remember that before you go putting stock in him. He shouldn't even be here, far as I can see." "Why is he, then?" I asked. "You know what they say. We de os de chiens." It was a common expression in the quarter. Where there are bones, there are dogs. Mammon had often said it to remind me not to trust the folks who were suddenly friendly when I had something to offer. Was that what Mr. Kelly was doing with Mrs. O'Halloran? Was her insurance policy the bone he was after, or was she? Mrs. O'Halloran hadn't seemed ready to be thinking of another man. If there was one thing I felt sure of, it was that she loved her Jimmy and was in no state to be wooed. But Mr. Kelly might be hoping to make himself the first man she'd think of when she was ready. "If I were you," Bugeaud's eyes strayed toward the door at the far end of the train, and his expression stiffened. Without another word, he turned and headed down the aisle. I watched him go. When he opened the door and passed through to the platform between the cars, I saw a flash of brown. I leaned out into the aisle to see better. Sergeant Hayworth was standing there smoking a cigarette. His eyes caught mine briefly as Bugeaud stormed past him, and he smiled at me. Not a friendly smile, more an "I caught you in the act" kind of smile, which made my insides squirm. He kept smiling till he finished his cigarette. Then he flicked the butt off the train and followed Bugeaud onto the next car. I wish Bugeaud had been able to finish his sentence. Still, it had been a useful conversation, I decided once I got over my initial fright. I knew a few things now. First, Bugeaud had no love for Kelly. Not that there was any great surprise there. Kelly was about as likable as a cockroach in your jambalaya. But judging by Bugeaud's sweat and the way his little piggy eyes had dilated, he feared Kelly too. Second, Bugeaud wasn't much good at holding his tongue. Third, as much as I wished it weren't true, Kelly was out to get something from Mrs. O'Halloran, as I had originally suspected. And finally, Bugeaud was afraid of having Jimmy O'Halloran's death pinned on him. Did that confirm that Jimmy's death was murder? Not necessarily, but it did confirm that Bugeaud seemed as skittish as a hare, and not much smarter than one. Kelly, on the other hand, seemed awfully smart when compared to Bugeaud, and unlikable as he was more interesting than ever. Maybe getting in with him wasn't the worst idea. If I did, maybe then I wouldn't have to work my way to the head office of the mob in Chicago after all. Maybe Kelly was a man who could take me straight there. And maybe, by getting in with Mr. Kelly, maybe that was the best way for me to look out for Mrs. O'Halloran, too. Applying for a job with a gangster wasn't something to attempt on an empty stomach. I thought again of Terrence and Leon's offer. I could sneak up to the colored car now, and no one would be the wiser. So I stood, straightened my shabby coat, and strode forward in search of lunch. The colored folks' lounge car was noisy and packed with people. In the back corner, a group of old men were gathered around a table playing penny ante poker. Families were gathered here and there along the length of the narrow car, talking, laughing, teasing. Little girls sat on the floor together playing with rag dolls. A counter in the corner opposite the card players offered food and drink. Several porters, looking much more relaxed than those I'd seen in the other parts of the train, were serving up plates of food from pots and kettles behind the counter. I could smell the aromas from where I stood in the doorway. The warmth of family tugged at my heart and the food at my taste buds, and before I knew it, I was pulled into the car and making for the line at the food counter. I was aware of people glancing my way and whispering as I walked the length of the car. I didn't belong there, white as I was, standing out like a sore thumb. But with no sign of Leon and Terence, all I could think to do was try to put on an innocent face, like a little kid who could still mix without reproach. There was a short line at the counter. I took my place politely at the back, but everyone shifted aside and let me through to the counter first. They gave me grudging looks as I stepped up, which seemed a little unfair. I hadn't asked for any favors. But I reckon it also wasn't fair that my skin color gave me privileges, even here in the car reserved for them. The porter behind the counter, who had seemed so relaxed when I spotted him from the doorway, stiffened at the sight of me and checked to make sure his jacket was buttoned. "Can I help you, sir?" he said. "I think they were there first," I said, pointing to the folks who had let me by. He shook his head. "What can I do for you, sir? Is there something needs cleaning up in your car? I'll get right on it." "No, sir. I would like to order lunch." The porter looked amused and a little embarrassed at that. "You've come to the wrong place, sir. Your dining car's toward the back of the train. That's where you'll be wanting lunch." I glanced at the pot behind the counter and the greasy green mass floating in it. I'd seen plenty of pots like that when I was doing odd jobs in the poor parts of town. "It's just that I got a hankering for fatback and collard greens, and Terence and Leon invited me to come up here for some," I said. Behind me I heard a woman say, "Well, I'll be." And another replied, "If that don't beat all." "Does your mama know you're here?" the porter asked. "My mama's not on the train, nor my daddy. I'm on my own. Are Terence and Leon here?" The porter grumbled, but he heaped a pile of greens onto a plate, making sure I got a big hunk of the fatback in it. Then he added cornbread, fried hominy, and some cracklings. It was the biggest plate of food I'd seen in days, and the whole thing only cost me a nickel. I paid and looked around the car for a place to sit and eat. My eyes went to an empty bench at a table in the corner. I liked corners where I could be out of sight and out of mind, but there was no chance of my being invisible here. As I made my way to the empty seat, the ladies seated on the opposite bench picked up their plates and moved, though there was no other open seats in the car. With a twinge of guilt, I tried to tell them that it wasn't necessary, but they pretended not to hear. So I took my seat and dug into the food. I suppose most kids my age would have objected to eating all those greens, but I had long since learned not to object to anything that would fill my innards. I would have enjoyed my lunch more, though, if everyone hadn't kept staring at me. When I looked up from my plate, their eyes slid off me like butter off hot corn, but I could feel their minds still turned my way. The room had taken on a restrained feeling, as if all the love and laughter they'd been sharing had to be hidden away from me. Terence and Leon still didn't seem to be anywhere in the crowd. I guessed they had given up on me, or hadn't been serious to start with. I began shoveling the food into my mouth as fast as I could, eager to get out of the car and back to my own. "You eat like you ain't seen food in a week." I looked up to see both boys standing by the table watching me. I had no idea where they'd come from. "I bet he ain't," said Leon. "Told you he was a gutter snipe. I bet you don't even have an aunt in Chicago. I bet you got nobody." "Do so," I said, still shoveling greens into my mouth. "She's got a fine big place up there, servants and feather beds and everything." Leon grinned and nodded in a way that said he didn't believe a word of it. "Does that Yankee aunt of yours like collard greens as much as you do?" "Don't know. I ain't never stayed with her before. That's why I figure I got to get my fill of 'em now," I said, challenging his smile with an even bigger one of my own. Terence giggled. "You got greens stuck between your teeth," he said. "Can I have some of your cracklins?" With that, he sat down in one of the seats the women had vacated, and Leon followed. I turned my plate and let Terence help himself. "So I bet you want to hear our proposition now, don't you?" Terence said, grinning so big his round cheeks bunched up into dimples. "Proposition," Leon corrected. His look was still a little hostile, but I was beginning to suspect he was more bark than bite. "Not really," I said. "Yes, you do," Terence said, still grinning. "Remember the coffin you saw when you got on the train? Well, we're going to find out who's in that coffin, and we're going to let you help us, right, Leon?" I looked at Leon. "Is that why you were in the baggage car before, trying to figure out who's dead in that box?" I asked. "I told you I was in the baggage car because I was working, loading the mail." I see. Well, I already know who's in the coffin," I said. "You do?" Terence's face lit up like Bourbon Street on Mardi Gras. I gave them a sly smile, and I took a big bite of cornbread, chewing slow and deliberate. "And," said Leon when it was obvious I wasn't going to say anything else. "You got access to the baggage car. Why don't you see for yourself?" I said. "We already tried that," Terence said. "You tried opening the coffin?" "No, we figured the coffin's traveling with that widow. So we went into the baggage car and looked for a name on her trunk. It's new and mighty fancy with the initials N.O. on the lock. That's all we found out," said Leon. "So who is it?" Taryn asked. "We know you're in the same car with the widow. What's N.O. stand for?" He was bouncing up and down in his seat with anticipation, and his excitement got the better of me. "The dead man's a fella named Jimmy O'Halloran," I said. At once, both Terence's and Leon's eyes grew wide. "The Jimmy O'Halloran?" Leon asked. "You know him?" "Well, sure," Terence said. "But that can't be his widow in your car." "It is. It's Nanette O'Halloran," I said. "But—" "Hush up, Terence," Leon said sharply. I started to ask Terence what he was going to say, but then the whole lounge car went silent. I looked up. There stood 3 white men, Alphonse Bugeaud, Mr. Kelly, and their knuckle-cracking companion, all glaring around at the crowd. Then they spotted me and headed my way. Leon practically jumped out of his seat, grabbing a handful of Terence's shirt on the way. Slick as gators on a riverbank, they slipped into the crowd and disappeared. I looked up at the 3 men and tried to smile. They didn't smile back. Had Bugeaud talked to Kelly and discovered I'd tricked him into telling me more than he ought? I had a feeling it was all about to come out, and what exactly it was I couldn't say. I was just glad Nanette O'Halloran wasn't there. I figured I was about to either declare my intention to be a crook or get pounded before I could do so. And I was glad that whichever it was going to be, and I'd know in a matter of seconds, she wouldn't be there to see it.